When historians describe the fall of the Roman Empire, they usually point to barbarian invasions, a weakened army, or moral decay. Yet the real story unfolded in a far more subtle and dangerous way. Instead of enemy swords destroying the most powerful empire in the world, the true cause was the collapse of its own economic system. This story begins during Rome's Golden Age under Emperor Augustus. At that time, the silver coin known as the denarius was accepted throughout the Mediterranean world. It was not merely a tool for trade, but a symbol of Rome's strength and reliability. The silver content of a single denarius was about 95%, and everyone understood what that represented. Merchants traded with it from Spain to Egypt. Roman legionaries received their wages in denarii, and taxes were paid with the same coin. The system was so stable that people preferred to keep their money circulating in the economy rather than burying it in the ground. However, after Augustus' death, successive emperors faced a growing problem. As the empire expanded, military expenses increased dramatically and eventually became uncontrollable. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had to be stationed along the Danube and Rhine frontiers. Each new emperor, upon taking the throne, was forced to secure the loyalty of the army by paying generous bonuses. To keep the population satisfied, free grain distributions and grand gladiator games were required. The cost of all this was enormous. Tax revenues were no longer sufficient to cover these expenses. The emperors needed a solution, but the one they chose would turn out to be a poisoned remedy. During the reign of Nero, the silver content of the denarius was reduced for the first time. At the beginning, the change was so small that it went almost unnoticed. Only a few percentage points were removed. No one paid much attention because the stamp on the coin was still the same, and the authority of the emperor stood behind it. What began as a small adjustment quickly turned into a collapsing domino. Each new emperor reduced the silver content a little more than the last. Over the course of a century, the silver purity of the denarius fell from 95% to barely 50%. By the mid-3rd century, the situation spiraled out of control. Under Emperor Gallienus, the denarius contained only about 5% silver. The rest was copper and lead, coated with a thin layer of silver that wore away quickly with use. People soon realized that the coins in their hands were no longer worth what they claimed to be. That realization triggered chaos in the markets. Older coins became more valuable than newly minted ones because they contained more real silver. Citizens began hoarding the old money and spending only the new inferior coins. This phenomenon is known in modern economics as Gresham's law. Bad money drives good money out of circulation. That was exactly what happened in Rome. The state kept minting new coins, but none of them had real backing. Prices began to rise steadily. The price of wheat doubled within a decade, then doubled again in the next. By the end of the 3rd century, prices were nearly 100 times higher than they had been a century earlier. It was the worst inflation crisis in Roman history. Soldiers and state officials, paid fixed amounts in denarii, could no longer survive. A legionary's salary was unchanged on paper, but its purchasing power collapsed. Mutinies followed. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. In just 50 years, 26 emperors took the throne, most of them killed by their own troops. Each new ruler printed more money to buy loyalty, feeding inflation even further. As the economy collapsed, Rome's trade networks fractured. Merchants refused to accept denarii. In some regions, people returned to barter, trading grain for grain and wine for olive oil. Cities could no longer cope with inflation and began minting their own local currencies, but these were no more trustworthy than the imperial coins. Mediterranean trade slowed dramatically because no one knew which currency would be accepted where. The long-distance trade networks that formed the backbone of the Roman economy began to collapse one by one. Silver mines in Spain were no longer profitable because the extracted silver was immediately seized by the state and turned into debased coins. Grain shipments from Egypt became irregular as farmers refused to sell their harvest in exchange for Roman money. Peasants were forced to pay taxes in kind, but this system proved inefficient. While grain rotted in storage facilities, hunger spread through the cities. Because the logistics system itself was breaking down, the wealthy converted their assets into land and gold. They retreated into their villas and established self-sufficient estates. Over time, these villas turned into fortified compounds. Walls were built, and private security forces were formed. Meanwhile, the middle class disappeared entirely. Artisans and small merchants went bankrupt. Families were forced to shut down businesses that had survived for generations. To survive, people placed themselves under the protection of large landowners, becoming laborers bound to the land. This marked the emergence of feudalism. When Emperor Diocletian came to power, the Roman economy was on its deathbed. His solution was more control and more regulation. He issued the famous edict on maximum prices, setting a maximum price for every product in the empire. From a pair of shoes to a loaf of bread, from a slave to a camel load, everything was listed. The edict stated that anyone selling above these prices would be executed. But economic laws proved stronger than imperial decrees. Merchants refused to sell at the imposed prices because it meant operating at a loss. Many closed their shops. Others turned to black markets, selling illegally at higher prices. No matter how harsh the state became, it could never truly control the market. Diocletian also banned occupational mobility. The son of a baker was required to become a baker. The child of a stonemason was expected to remain a stonemason. By preventing people from changing professions, the state aimed to secure stable tax revenues. Instead, this policy hardened society and killed innovation. Technological progress in Rome came to a standstill because individuals could no longer choose work based on their abilities. At the same time, the army underwent a dramatic transformation. Roman citizens no longer wanted to serve as soldiers because wages had become worthless and service conditions were brutal. The empire began recruiting soldiers from beyond its borders, drawing from barbarian tribes such as the Goths, Franks, and Vandals. At first, this did not seem problematic. These warriors were skilled and willing to fight for Rome. Over time, however, the composition of the army changed. By the late 4th century, the majority of Roman legions were no longer Roman. Even the commanders were increasingly generals of barbarian origin. Their loyalty to Rome was uncertain. Tribal ties often mattered more to them than imperial interests. The monetary problem was never truly resolved. Constantine introduced a major monetary reform and launched a new gold coin known as the solidus. This coin was made of real gold and maintained its value. But there was a crucial issue. Gold coins were used almost exclusively by the wealthy. Ordinary people were still forced to trade with debased bronze coins. The economy split in two. On one side stood an elite class operating in gold. On the other stood the mass of the population struggling under relentless inflation. The state now demanded taxes in gold or in goods. Money itself had effectively lost its function. During harvest season, peasants were forced to surrender large portions of their crops when state officials arrived. The system became so oppressive that many people abandoned their land and fled into forests. The state hunted down runaway peasants and forcibly returned them to their fields. Cities began to empty because urban life no longer made economic sense. Trade had effectively come to a halt, and unemployment had reached unprecedented levels. There were no job opportunities left for ordinary people. Tax collectors were ruthless, and there was nowhere to escape them. Many people fled to rural areas and placed themselves under the protection of large landowners. Rome's great cities began to shrink. The city of Rome itself, which had once been home to nearly 1 million people, fell to a population of only 50,000 by the 5th century. Aqueducts collapsed due to neglect. Forums stood empty and crumbled into ruins. Public baths were closed because no one could afford the costs of operating them. Roads were no longer maintained, making trade caravans dangerous and unreliable. The empire's infrastructure slowly rotted away. By the 5th century, Rome was powerful only on paper. In reality, the central government controlled little more than Italy and a few surrounding regions. The provinces had become effectively independent. Local strongmen ruled their territories, using tax revenues for their own purposes. Instead of sending them to Rome, the army was Roman in name only. Barbarian generals commanded their own forces, and emperors depended entirely on their loyalty. Eventually, a barbarian general named Odoacer brought the process to its formal conclusion. In the year 476, he deposed the last Western Roman emperor. But this was not a dramatic collapse. Few people even noticed, because the empire had already been functionally dead for decades. Economic collapse had preceded military and political collapse by a long margin. Once the monetary system failed, the dominoes fell one after another. People no longer trusted the Roman system. Trade networks disintegrated. Cities emptied. The middle class vanished. The army passed into the hands of barbarian groups. In the end, no one fought to defend Rome, because there was nothing left worth defending. For centuries, historians blamed Rome's fall on moral decay, luxury, or the rise of Christianity. But the true cause was far simpler and far more ruthless. Rome destroyed its own money. In its pursuit of short-term solutions, the state engineered long-term catastrophe. With every new debased coin, the foundations of the system eroded a little more. When modern economists examine the story of Rome, they see striking similarities with today's economic systems and recurring crises. Money printing, inflation, price controls, and cycles of economic collapse have repeated themselves throughout history. In other words, they are not solutions newly discovered in the modern era to save economies. Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and countless other cases followed the same path and made the same mistakes. Whenever states financed their spending by printing money, the outcome was always the same. Rome's experience offers a powerful lesson. The strength of an empire is not measured by the size of its armies or the vastness of its territory, but by the resilience of its economic system. Once trust is lost, it is almost impossible to restore. When Roman citizens stopped trusting the denarius, the system was doomed to collapse. No military victory and no political reform could compensate for that loss of confidence. What is particularly striking is that the eastern half of the empire survived. The Byzantine Empire endured for another 1,000 years, largely because it succeeded in protecting its monetary system. The gold solidus retained its value and remained a trusted instrument in Mediterranean trade. Byzantine emperors learned from the West's mistakes and actively defended the integrity of their currency. Of course, Byzantium eventually fell for many reasons, but economic stability bought it centuries of survival. Rome's legacy is still all around us today. Our legal systems, architecture, languages, and political institutions all trace back to Rome, but perhaps its most important legacy is an economic one. Money is not merely paper or metal. Money is trust. As long as people believe in a currency, it holds value. When a state abuses that trust, the consequences are disastrous. It was not barbarian armies that destroyed the Roman Empire, but the economic ignorance of its own policymakers. Every emperor who reduced the silver content of the denarius was quietly undermining the foundations of the empire. Eventually, the structure collapsed, not under the blows of swords, but under the weight of bad economic decisions. This is one of history's greatest economic lessons. Civilizations rarely fall because of external enemies. They collapse from internal economic decay. Rome shows that military power, cultural richness, and technological superiority cannot save an empire without a solid economic foundation. Perhaps it surprised you as well to learn that Rome did not fall to swords, but to financial mistakes. Even the most magnificent empires can lose centuries of legacy through seemingly simple policies. It is possible that similar mistakes are being made in the lands you live in today. Once you begin to look around with this perspective, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. We will meet again in the next video.